singer, pilot, actor. In this video, we will look at the iconic life of Christopher Lee. Born May 27, 1922, Lee was taking his first steps towards a career spanning more than 60 years in the film industry. Lee was not only going to be famous, he was going to live a life many would find hard to believe. Born post-World War I and in a country spiralling towards recession, Lee had been thrown into a chaotic world. However, his dad being a lieutenant colonel and his mum an Italian countess, Lee was not shy of nobility, and nor was his household, where he came into contact with VIPs on a daily occurrence. After turning 4, his parents contemplated divorce, leaving Lee to live in Switzerland with his mum. This is also the homeland of his first major role, Rumpelstiltskin. This major role wasn't good enough, and Lee soon returned to London, where his mother married a banker. This person I shall return to later in the story. Fulham happened to be the next destination for Lee with his new family, before shortly enrolling at Oxford boarding school. Now, I might add, at this time the boarding school was basically the Southampton of the league, feeding its students to the bigger fish. His best opportunity would be to apply to Eton College. Unfortunately, his ability in mathematics led to his rejection, and Wellington College is where Lee became known as a useful and skilled linguist, learning 4 languages fluently and a general knowledge of 3 others. Talk of war and other inconveniences led to the end of Lee's youth as a student, leaving the college just before the start of the Second World War. This meant Lee had 2 options: stick around long enough to find a job, or leave the country for France and visit his sister. Whilst there, news had spread like wildfire. The last public execution was set to be held in Paris. Lee did not hesitate and head there to stay with some Russian friends on his mother's side. Personally, all this sounds delightful. So much so, Lee actually wanted to stay in France. However, with war brewing across Europe, it was time to return to London.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
1939. War breaks out across the world, and although being too young, Lee was eager to participate. Heading out to Finland with some friends to aid against Russia, this excursion was quickly ended. He and the others had no clue how to ski, and therefore would have been no use at the time. When he returned from his little adventure to the Alps, Lee continued his job as an office clerk until the age of 18. Sadly, the same year his father died. Lee was not going to follow in his father's career, and so enlisted himself to the Royal Air Force. Training in Payton, he was swiftly moved to what is now called Zimbabwe. This too, like Finland, was cut short. He had been suffering with his vision and temporary blackouts, which, if you didn't know it, is not very handy as a pilot. This led to him being in limbo, often moved around but with no real purpose. Eventually he was positioned as a warder in Zimbabwe for a short period, before working for an RAF squadron as an intelligence agent. This is where Lee almost lost his life for the first time. German bombers attacked the airbase, almost costing him his life. The Battle of Rome, otherwise known as the Battle of Monte Cassino, is where some of the bloodiest fighting happened to take place during the war. Christopher had recently been deployed here also, after an officer swap. This change in jobs almost cost him his life when a plane crash landed after takeoff. As the end of the war approached, Lee found himself based in the Air Force HQ, where he was given the position Registry of War Criminals of Security Suspects. This basically meant
be doing one thing and one thing only: killing Nazis.
After years of service in the army, Lee felt disinclined to return to office work, which made it challenging for him to explore new career options. One day, while dining with his cousin, who happened to be the Italian ambassador to England, the topic of acting came up. This is something Lee thought about for a while after their conversation, eventually seeking his mother's opinion. She quickly squashed these dreams and told him to move on. Lee was determined to prove her wrong and spent time perfecting his craft. This came with its own struggles, but eventually the role started coming. His first big break came in the shape of a monster. He was to portray Frankenstein's creation. This was a big hit, and eventually, with a strong fandom behind him, Dracula was next. Ironically, just like the character himself, the studio wanted to suck all the life out of Lee, and in light terms, blackmailed him to play Dracula.
Here comes the crunch. Think of the people you'll put out of work if you don't do it.
This meant Lee was stuck in the horror genre for over a decade, landing small roles for a largely forgettable amount of recognition. He auditioned for The Longest Day in 1962, but was surprisingly turned down for not being military enough. Another role came to Lee, this time in the style of narration. It was only until after it had been released he realised it was for a soft porno.
True. The shadows of my past remain here.
In 1970, he became Sherlock's older brother, Mycroft, in the hit movie The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. It then took only 3 years for him to be cast in possibly his best movie, The Wicker Man.
I could a tale unfold, whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul.
If we rewind to the start of this video, I spoke of a banker. That man was actually Ian Fleming's uncle. And in the 60s, when Ian had been getting a bit of a name for himself, he had offered Lee a villain role in his latest movie adaptation.
This is the part I really like.
The title of the movie was James Bond. This was not meant to be though, after the producers had already cast their star. Fortunately, Lee got his chance years later when he became Scaramanga in the 10th adaptation, The Man with the Golden Gun. Christopher was sure if he was to stay in England, he might never leave the horror industry, so off to America he went. The first of many films followed, Airport 77, which is an action air disaster plot. And then only 2 years later, he starred in a war comedy spoof called 1941, directed by Steven Spielberg. He also turned down the role in a comedy remake of his previous movie Airport 77, called Airplane. Leslie Nielsen ended up starring in this instead, something Lee called a big regret.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
During the 80s and the 90s, he also starred in movies such as The Death Train with Pierce Brosnan, or The Gremlins 2, even the Police Academy Mission to Moscow. There are also appearances in games, cartoons, and comics.
May I kiss you again?
No, you may not.
I can get you diseases. You'd like that, wouldn't you?
Just before the turn of the new century, he was cast in one of his most controversial and demanding jobs, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The movie was not commercially successful, but it was a success for Lee. It had been a few years since he'd starred in a big budget movie, come forward a dream opportunity. Since he was younger, Lee had read J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings every year, and was eventually cast as Saruman, even if he did originally want to play Gandalf. Notable mentions were made of Lee's effort from the cast, even speaking to Peter Jackson about the sound a knife makes going into someone's back, something Jackson would not question.
Peter, have you any idea what kind of noise happens when somebody's stabbed in the back? And I said, well, because I do.
Lee is also the only member of the movies to meet the man himself, back in the 50s in an Oxford pub. He spoke of the memory with fondness in meeting his idol. With the success of Lord of the Rings, the next big franchise came calling. This time, he was to play a force-wielding Sith in Star Wars. This was an underused role, but one which really made Lee come into a new generation of fans. One role which particularly stood out was his portrayal of Johnny Depp's father in the hit remake, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. This was not the first time Lee had worked with Tim Burton, and not the last time either. In 2009, he was no longer Christopher Lee, but Sir instead. He had been knighted for his contributions to drama and charity. Christopher Lee was a phenomenal actor, and one whose life may never be replicated. The man had it all. While his work did slow down later in his life, he continued to work on projects and give everything to the craft that had been his whole life. Many actors won't have the opportunity to have the life experience Lee did, But this generational actor, who has appeared in more movies than anyone else, deserves the respect as a true gentleman. On the 7th of June 2015, Sir Christopher Lee died at Westminster Hospital from heart failure. I'll end on this.
My career, my real career as an actor, started. I had 10 years of very hard work and all the background needed so that when the time came, I was ready. Shelf life, 10 years. If you're a star, 20 or 22 or 3 or 4. If you haven't got it, if you've got it, you've got the right instincts, the right imagination, the right powers of invention, if you have something behind you, some sort of foundations of experience and versatility, that's fine. You will go on, you will last.